revisiting the origins of Pablo Escobar, Colombia's notorious drug lord. Dateline Medellín, Colombia. Pablo Emilio Escobar Varela, the man who would later become synonymous with the global drug trade, was born on December 1, 1949, in Rio Negro, Antioquia, Colombia. Born to Jesus' daddy Escobar Echeverri, a struggling farmer, and Hermilda Gaviria, a schoolteacher, Pablo was the third of 7 children in a family familiar with financial hardship. The Escobar family relocated to Medellín during Pablo's youth, joining thousands of others seeking opportunities in the rapidly expanding industrial hub.
No existe en el mundo.
Medellín, once a modest settlement founded in the early 17th century, had grown into Colombia's industrial capital by the mid-20th century. But its growth came with a shadow of widespread urban poverty. By the time Escobar was a teenager, Medellín's population had exceeded 1 million, and the economic disparity created fertile ground for crime. Despite his mother's aspirations for his education, Pablo's academic potential was never realized. By 14, he had joined a gang, embracing a life of petty crime. His early ventures into criminality saw him expelled from school and involved in violent confrontations. One such incident culminated in him shooting a fellow gang member, Julio Gaviria, in the foot, an act that landed him in jail for the first time. Escobar's early brushes with the law and his subsequent rise to power in Medellín's criminal underworld set the stage for the reign of terror that would define his later years. While his story has been immortalized in history books and media, these formative years reflect the environment that molded one of the most infamous figures of the 20th century. In his youth, Pablo Escobar's early criminal ventures became the stuff of folklore. Accounts vary widely. Some claim he pilfered gravestones, sanding down inscriptions to resell them as new. Others suggest he masterminded a racket, selling forged high school and university diplomas. The blurred lines between fact and fiction in these stories mirror the chaotic environment that shaped Escobar's rise. Escobar's trajectory must be understood against Colombia's backdrop of 20th century turmoil, where politics and narcotics became inextricably linked. The country's deep-rooted political divisions between liberals and conservatives were exacerbated by U.S. influence under the Monroe Doctrine, which treated the Americas as a U.S. sphere of control. Early 20th century American business interests exploited Colombia's resources, creating economic disparity and entrenching poverty. By the mid-century, Colombia's political instability erupted. The 1948 assassination of populist leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitan plunged the nation into La Violencia, a brutal decade-long civil war claiming over 200,000 lives. The fragile peace that followed under the National Front coalition failed to resolve deep-seated inequalities. U.S. intervention further complicated matters as Cold War policies targeted leftist groups, leading to the rise of guerrilla movements such as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, in 1964. As FARC and other paramilitary factions gained control of rural regions, a new force emerged: global demand for illicit drugs. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the narcotics trade became a lucrative enterprise, filling the void created by political unrest and economic stagnation. Pablo Escobar seized this opportunity, leveraging Medellín's urban poverty and his connections in the criminal underworld to establish a foothold in the burgeoning drug trade. The convergence of political unrest, economic inequality, and soaring international drug demand set the stage for Escobar's transformation into the king of cocaine. By the late 1960s, Colombia's vast rural jungles and increasing lawlessness had made it an ideal hub for cocaine production, with the country's conditions perfectly suited for cultivating coca plants. Initially, marijuana dominated the narcotics trade, but the explosive demand for cocaine derived from the coca plant transformed Colombia into a global center of the trade. At first, groups like the FARC did not directly produce or transport cocaine, but taxed producers operating within their territories. This income was vital for funding their prolonged guerrilla war against the Colombian government. Over time, FARC and similar factions began engaging directly in cocaine production, intertwining the drug trade with Colombia's turbulent political and social dynamics. This was the environment in which Pablo Escobar began his criminal career in the late 1960s. By his late teens, Escobar was involved in small-scale organized crime in Medellín alongside Oscar Bernal Aguirre. Together, they sold contraband cigarettes, stole cars, and orchestrated kidnappings, collecting significant ransoms. Escobar's ambition was insatiable. He wanted wealth and was willing to commit any crime to achieve it. By the early 1970s, Escobar was smuggling marijuana, a natural precursor to his eventual focus on cocaine. This shift marked the beginning of his rise in the narcotics industry. Around this time, he also began courting Maria Victoria Henao, a teenager whose mother reportedly warned her about Escobar, predicting a life of prison visits if she chose to marry him. Undeterred, Maria married Pablo in 1976, when he was 26 and she was just 15. They went on to have 2 children, Juan Pablo and Manuela. Escobar's entry into the cocaine trade came shortly before his marriage. He was introduced to the business by Griselda Blanco, a notorious drug smuggler known as the Black Widow and a key figure in the rise of the cocaine industry. Under Blanco's mentorship, Escobar learned the trade's inner workings, laying the foundation for his empire. In the mid-1970s, as cocaine demand surged in the US and Europe, Escobar transitioned from smuggling to production and distribution, quickly realizing the immense profits the drug could generate. This marked the beginning of his transformation from a petty criminal into a global narcotics kingpin, a figure whose influence would shape Colombia's history for decades to come. The next chapter in Escobar's story would see him consolidate his power, establish the Medellín Cartel, and become one of the most infamous figures in modern history. In the swinging 1970s, while Americans were donning bell-bottoms and boogieing down under disco lights, a different kind of white powder was taking the US by storm. Cocaine. Once a niche indulgence for the elite, cocaine became the drug of choice in the pulsating party scene of New York, Miami, and beyond. And back in Colombia, a young and ambitious Pablo Escobar saw an opportunity that glittered brighter than a disco ball. Initially, Pablo started small. He ran errands for Medellín's established smugglers, delivering coca paste to processing facilities with all the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy store, if the candy store were, illegal. But in true entrepreneurial fashion, Escobar soon decided that middlemen were overrated. Why split profits when you could do it all yourself? By the mid-1970s, Pablo had moved on to organizing flights that ferried powdered cocaine directly to the US, crafting the rudimentary beginnings of what would become the Medellín Cartel. Little did they know, these scrappy smugglers were building an empire that would someday rival multinational corporations, in scale at least, if not in moral standing. However, just as things were getting spicy, the story nearly ended prematurely. In May 1976, Escobar and his crew were caught red-handed with 18 kilograms of coca paste, a haul sizable enough to land anyone in serious hot water. Pablo's first instinct? Bribery, of course. But when greasing palms didn't work, he opted for Plan B, eliminating the arresting officers. If this sounds like the plot of a telenovela, you're not far off. The authorities, faced with the increasingly risky business of pursuing Escobar, eventually dropped the case, and Pablo walked away scot-free. His methods were as clear as day. If money didn't talk, bullets would. From then on, Escobar's playbook was a mix of charm, ruthless pragmatism, and a casual disregard for human life, a strategy that would define his rise to power. By the late 1970s, Escobar wasn't just dabbling in the drug trade, he was dominating it. His operations boomed, thanks in part to his keen business acumen and the cartel's knack for smuggling cocaine into the US with innovative methods. Let's just say if smugglers were eligible for awards, the Medellín Cartel would have cleaned up at a cocaine logistics convention. And yet, amid the violence and corruption, Pablo maintained a peculiar image. He painted himself as a humble merchant, someone just providing a service to meet the inevitable legalization of drugs. If you ignored the thousands of people he had killed, he might have seemed almost reasonable, like your local grocer, but with a far deadlier product line, One might imagine Escobar delivering his humble trader pitch with a straight face, while behind him, the Medellín cartel rolled out their latest innovation in cocaine delivery. You could almost hear him saying, "I'm just an exporter of flowers," as his henchmen loaded their bouquets onto a plane bound for Miami. The late 70s were just the start. Escobar's operation would grow into one of the largest and most violent criminal enterprises in history. But in those early days, there was still a strange, almost comedic absurdity to the man who would one day be known as the King of Cocaine. By the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar's ambitions were matched only by the size of his operations. In an unlikely twist of fate, two former mid-level smugglers, Carlos Later and George Jung, fresh from a Connecticut prison stint, found themselves entangled in Escobar's growing empire. Carlos, a German Colombian known for his paranoia and brutality, and George, an American with a knack for logistics, were unlikely allies. But their combined expertise would help solidify one of the Medellín cartel's boldest ventures. Their prison-born plan involved moving beyond marijuana to capitalize on the exploding demand for cocaine in the United States. Upon release, they got to work, smuggling massive amounts of cocaine through the Caribbean, with Florida's Miami serving as the primary entry point. Escobar, ever the opportunist, saw their potential and brought them on board to expand his empire. The game changer came in 1978, when Later, driven by both ambition and an uncanny resemblance to a Bond villain, set his sights on Norman's Cay, a small Bahamian island. He bought property, bullied locals into selling theirs, and in some cases, eliminated those who refused. Within months, Norman's Cay transformed from a sleepy paradise into a fortress of illicit activity. Later poured millions into the island, building a runway and warehouses to create the perfect cocaine transit hub. The process was seamless. Large aircraft ferried cocaine to Norman's Cay, where it was offloaded, repackaged, and sent to the U.S. in smaller planes designed to evade radar detection. At its peak, Norman's Cay handled over 300 kilograms of cocaine daily, a volume so staggering that it left even seasoned traffickers in awe. The operation's scale and sophistication turned the Medellín cartel into a billion-dollar enterprise almost overnight. Later, who had become fabulously wealthy, once reportedly offered to pay off Colombia's national debt in exchange for immunity, a move as audacious as it was absurd. And Escobar? Well, he was now an unstoppable force. With Norman's Cay as a linchpin in his smuggling operations, he and his associates were raking in profits so immense that they reportedly spent thousands of dollars annually on rubber bands just to bundle their cash. It wasn't just wealth, it was cartoonish levels of wealth. The Norman's Cay saga marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Medellín cartel, setting the stage for its dominance in the cocaine trade. But it also highlighted the precarious balance of the empire, built on ambition, ruthlessness, and a runway in the Caribbean. By the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar's name was synonymous with opulence, danger, and creativity in equal measure. One of his crowning glories, Hacienda Nápoles, was more than just a home. It was a testament to his excesses. This sprawling estate was a bizarre mix of luxury, wildlife sanctuary, and amusement park. It boasted exotic animals imported from across the globe, from elephants and giraffes to Escobar's personal favorites, hippos. In fact, his hippo fascination was so intense that their descendants now roam the Colombian countryside, creating a population of cocaine hippos that wildlife officials still grapple with today. But Escobar didn't stop there. Hacienda Nápoles also featured vintage cars, a zoo, a sculpture garden, a bull ring, a private airport, and even a go-kart track. His ambition to construct a grand acropolis on the estate remained unrealized. The Pink Mansion in Miami and beyond. The man who was flooding the United States with cocaine in unimaginable quantities also managed to purchase a pink mansion in Miami Beach, complete with his own name on the deed. At this stage, Escobar was still operating under relative anonymity, which allowed him to acquire such a conspicuous property without immediate suspicion. Of course, the US government eventually seized it, but for a brief moment in time, Escobar casually lived like a drug lord in broad daylight. In the Caribbean, Escobar developed another luxury estate on Isla Grande, part of the Rosario Islands. This estate mirrored Hacienda Nápoles in extravagance, with its helicopter pad, lavish apartments, and imported animals. While the main purpose of some properties was indulgence, others served as hiding spots for his immense wealth, as the cartel hid money in every nook and cranny imaginable. As the Medellín cartel grew exponentially into the early 1980s, Escobar's empire required increasingly ingenious methods to transport his product. Beyond planes and speedboats, the cartel introduced a James Bond-worthy innovation: submarines. Yes, boats towing small, drug-laden submarines became a standard part of their operations, delivering countless kilos of cocaine undetected. At the height of his power, Escobar's smuggling operation brought in profits of up to $60 million a day. With such wealth flowing in, the cartel diversified its supply chain, sourcing coca paste not just from Colombian plantations, but from neighboring countries like Peru and Bolivia. These expansions solidified Escobar's grip on the global cocaine trade, making him both a legend and a menace. Escobar's combination of entrepreneurial genius and ruthlessness fueled a juggernaut that was almost impossible to stop. By the early 1980s, his cartel controlled cocaine routes into both the US and Europe, raking in billions annually. But with this meteoric rise came escalating violence, corruption, and a man who increasingly believed his wealth could buy or bury any obstacle in his path. As his legend grew, so too did the audacity of his operations. From hippos to submarines, Escobar wasn't just a drug lord. He was an outlaw who operated on a scale so surreal it almost defied belief. As the threat of extradition to the United States loomed larger, Pablo Escobar turned to a cunning strategy to shield himself, cultivating the image of a benevolent leader and philanthropist. To many Colombians, particularly the impoverished citizens of Medellín, he became a modern-day Robin Hood. This persona was carefully crafted through a series of calculated gestures. In the early stages of his rise, Escobar managed to maintain the illusion that his activities caused little harm to ordinary Colombians, with most of the damage taking place far away in the United States. Exploiting an undercurrent of anti-American sentiment, Escobar painted the U.S. as a foreign aggressor meddling in Latin America, a narrative that resonated with many. To bolster this image, Escobar funneled a portion of his cartel's astronomical earnings back into the community. He handed out cash directly to the poor, sponsored massive infrastructure projects, and even turned his Hacienda Nápoles Zoo into a free attraction for the public. Roads around Medellín, notorious for gridlocks, were improved with funds from his empire. Perhaps most striking was Escobar's Christmas tradition, where he dressed as Santa Claus and distributed extravagant gifts to families in Medellín's poorest neighborhoods. These acts of generosity earned him adulation, creating a loyal base of support among those who viewed him as a savior amid poverty. By the early 1980s, Escobar's Robin Hood image began to fracture under the weight of his growing notoriety as the head of the Medellín cartel. Yet, instead of retreating, he took an audacious step, entering Colombian politics. In 1982, he ran as a candidate for the Colombian Liberal Party, aiming for a seat in the nation's Chamber of Representatives. His campaign was centered on a fiercely nationalist rhetoric, particularly his opposition to the extradition treaty with the United States. Escobar argued that the treaty undermined Colombia's sovereignty, accusing President Julio César Turbay of bowing to American pressure. This narrative resonated with many Colombians, especially those who distrusted foreign intervention. While Escobar's populist messaging gained traction, his campaign was tainted by violence and corruption. Critics who dared to challenge his motives faced severe consequences. At a public debate in Medellín, a vocal opponent accused Escobar of using politics to serve his personal interests. The aftermath was chilling. The man was detained by Medellín police, who were in the pocket of the cartel, and handed over to Escobar's enforcers. Days later, his bullet-ridden body was found on the city streets. Through a combination of intimidation and charisma, Escobar secured a seat in the Colombian Chamber of Representatives in March 1982. This marked the height of his political ambitions, but his rise to office only magnified the tension between his public persona as a benefactor and the brutal reality of his cartel's reign. Escobar's entry into politics was a bold gambit, one that revealed his ambitions extended beyond the drug trade. However, it also painted a larger target on his back, as his actions became impossible to ignore on both a national and international stage. Pablo Escobar's foray into politics, initially envisioned as a strategic maneuver to shield himself from extradition and gain legitimacy, quickly turned into a double-edged sword. While his position in the Colombian Chamber of Representatives gave him a platform to challenge the extradition treaty, it also thrust him into the national spotlight, intensifying scrutiny of his criminal activities. A threat to the establishment. By entering politics, Escobar positioned himself not just as a drug lord, but as a direct threat to Colombia's conservative political establishment. This shift did not go unnoticed by President Belisario Betancur, who assumed office in 1982. Viewing Escobar as a menace to the nation's sovereignty and governance, Betancur launched a campaign to dismantle his influence. The appointment of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla as Minister of Justice in 1983 marked a turning point. Lara, a fierce critic of the drug cartels, prioritized Escobar's prosecution. This included exposing Escobar's past, notably his 1976 arrest for drug-related charges, which had been shrouded in bribery and intimidation to avoid conviction. Colombian media joined the effort to erode Escobar's image, with the newspaper El Espectador publishing a damning exposé on his criminal background. The article detailed his arrest and subsequent cover-up efforts, presenting undeniable evidence of his ties to the drug trade. Escobar's reaction was swift and characteristic. He contemplated eliminating the newspaper's editor and ordered his men to purchase as many copies of the edition as possible to suppress its circulation. However, as additional reports surfaced, the controversy spiraled beyond his control. The media's scrutiny extended to Escobar's private life, revealing his affair with Virginia Vallejo, a renowned Colombian television presenter. Vallejo had gained unprecedented access to Escobar through an exclusive interview, and their relationship blossomed into a scandalous affair. The fallout was immediate and personal. Escobar's wife, Maria Victoria Henao, reacted furiously, temporarily evicting him from their home and threatening divorce. Though he managed to reconcile with Maria after persistent pleading, his affair with Vallejo continued sporadically for years, further tarnishing his reputation. Escobar's growing notoriety prompted legal repercussions. By late 1983, Gustavo Zuloaga's murder investigation, previously linked to Escobar, was reopened. The United States government also took action, revoking Escobar's visa and barring his entry into the country. Simultaneously, the Colombian Congress moved to strip Escobar of the immunity he enjoyed as a member of parliament. This decision marked a critical blow, exposing him to prosecution and signaling the erosion of his political shield. By the close of 1983, Escobar's carefully constructed political strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of gaining legitimacy, his political ambitions had made him a target of relentless opposition from the government, the media, and even elements of his personal life. Escobar's descent from a celebrated Robin Hood figure to the most notorious face of Colombia's drug trade underscored the dangers of overreach. His attempt to intertwine politics with crime had not only failed, but had accelerated his trajectory toward infamy and eventual downfall. Pablo Escobar's resignation from the Colombian Chamber of Representatives on January 20, 1984, marked a turning point in his life and his dealings with the Colombian government. In his resignation letter, Escobar positioned himself as a populist champion, railing against corruption, oligarchies, and indifference to the plight of the common people. However, his departure was anything but a retreat. It was a prelude to an even more aggressive phase in his campaign to protect his empire and thwart the government's efforts to bring him to justice. On April 30, 1984, just 3 months after Escobar's resignation, Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a staunch opponent of Escobar and a vocal critic of the cartels, was assassinated in a brazen attack. As Lara sat in his car in Bogotá traffic, 2 men on a Yamaha motorcycle approached. Ivan Dario Guisado, armed with an Uzi submachine gun, opened fire, killing Lara instantly. The attack was orchestrated on Escobar's orders, and though one of the assailants was killed in the shootout that followed, the assassination sent shockwaves through Colombia. The murder of Lara Bonilla was a turning point, signaling Escobar's transition from covert manipulation to overt aggression. It was seen as a declaration of war against the Colombian government, which now responded by fully enacting the extradition treaty with the United States, a move Escobar had long sought to prevent. Fearing retaliation, Escobar temporarily fled Colombia with his family, first to Panama and then to Nicaragua, which at the time was engulfed in civil war. These moves allowed him to evade immediate repercussions while strategizing his next steps. By late 1984, Escobar returned to Colombia, ready to escalate his conflict with the government. To bolster his efforts, Escobar aligned himself with the 19th of April movement, M19, a leftist guerrilla group that had gained prominence in the 1970s. M19, second only to the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, opposed the Colombian government and viewed the extradition treaty with the United States as an affront to the country's sovereignty. Escobar provided M19 with financial and logistical support, effectively turning them into allies in his battle against the state. On November 6, 1985, with Escobar's backing, M19 launched one of the most dramatic attacks in Colombian history. About 35 guerrilla fighters stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, taking over 300 people hostage, including nearly the entire Colombian Supreme Court. The siege was both a statement against the extradition treaty and a bold challenge to the government's authority. What followed was a blood-soaked standoff between the guerrillas and Colombian military forces. Over the course of 28 hours, the palace was reduced to ruins in a violent confrontation that left over 100 people dead, including 11 Supreme Court justices. While the immediate motive was to challenge the extradition treaty, some reports suggest that Escobar also used the attack as a cover to destroy evidence and legal cases related to his drug empire that were housed within the palace archives. The Palace of Justice siege marked the start of an era of heightened violence in Colombia, with Escobar at the center. His use of guerrilla allies and his willingness to attack state institutions underscored the lengths he was willing to go to protect his empire. It also made clear to the Colombian government and the world that Escobar was no ordinary criminal. He was a narco-terrorist with the resources to challenge an entire nation. From this point onward, the conflict between Escobar and the Colombian government intensified, plunging the country into a prolonged period of chaos and violence that would ultimately claim thousands of lives. The siege of the Palace of Justice continued into November 7, 1985, with escalating demands from the M19 guerrillas. They called for the immediate announcement of the extradition treaty and for President Betancourt's resignation, accusing him of failing to meet their political demands. Meanwhile, the Colombian army had surrounded the palace, preparing for a full assault. Escobar's involvement in this attack had triggered an unprecedented military confrontation right in the heart of the Colombian capital. As the standoff dragged on, there appeared to be a glimmer of hope for negotiation. Early that morning, the M19 agreed to release one of the hostages, Ronaldo Arce Negus, a state councilor. However, as the day wore on, tensions escalated again. By 2 p.m., General Jesus Armando Arias Corrales, the commander of the Army Division outside, ordered the storming of the building, signaling the end of any potential for peaceful resolution. The Army's assault on the Palace of Justice was catastrophic. Nearly 100 people were killed, including almost all of the M19 guerrillas and half of the Colombian Supreme Court justices. The bloody attack left Colombia reeling, but for Pablo Escobar, the aftermath of the siege had an unintended benefit. The Colombian government had lost a substantial amount of evidence and documentation on drug traffickers, including key details about Escobar's operations. At first, it was believed that the M19 had intentionally burned the documents to help Escobar evade prosecution. However, it seems more likely that the destruction occurred accidentally due to a fire caused by the explosives used by the army to break into the building. Despite the horrific loss of life, the fire that ravaged the palace turned out to be a strategic stroke of luck for Escobar, as much of the incriminating evidence against him was destroyed in the flames. The aftermath of the Palace of Justice attack further weakened President Betancourt's administration. His mishandling of the situation, resulting in the deaths of senior judges and numerous others, left his government vulnerable to criticism from both the public and political opponents. As the country faced national mourning and outrage, Betancourt's authority and ability to govern were severely damaged. In August 1986, Virgilio Barco emerged victorious in the presidential election, replacing Betancourt as Colombia's 27th president. Barco's stance on drug trafficking was even more aggressive than Betancourt's, and his administration would adopt tougher measures against Escobar and other cartels operating in Colombia. Escobar, however, was far from backing down. The escalation of the war against the Colombian state seemed only to fuel his resolve to resist and expand his empire. In January 1987, just months after Virgilio Barco's inauguration, the Colombian government showed its increased resolve to bring down Pablo Escobar. Police intercepted a convoy of Escobar's vehicles, which were moving from his hacienda Nápoles to a safe house in Medellín. Though Pablo himself was traveling separately from his wife, Maria, and their children, Juan and Manuela, they were arrested and held for several hours. This was a clear sign that the new government was intent on striking at Escobar in every possible way. Eventually, after Pablo's lawyers intervened, the family was released, but this incident marked an escalation in the battle between Escobar and the Colombian state. Escobar's challenges, however, did not stop with the government. In the late 1970s, as the Medellín cartel was growing under Escobar's leadership, another powerful cartel had emerged in southwestern Colombia, the Cali cartel. Initially, the two cartels worked together, sharing interests and collaborating to avoid legal troubles in Colombia and to launder their drug profits abroad. They had agreements in place to divide parts of the U.S. cocaine market, with Medellín dominating certain regions and Cali focusing on others. However, by the mid-1980s, tensions between the two cartels grew, fueled by a number of factors, including efforts by Rodriguez Garcia, a senior member of the Cali cartel, to break into the New York City cocaine market, an area that Medellín had traditionally controlled. By 1987, open warfare broke out between the two cartels, marked by rampant murders and bombings. One such bombing in 1988 even targeted Escobar's house, narrowly missing him. Despite his growing conflicts with both the Colombian government and the Cali cartel, Escobar's Medellín cartel reached the peak of its power and wealth in the mid to late 1980s. Fueled by the insatiable demand for cocaine in the United States, the cartel was generating a staggering $70 million per day, equivalent to about $25 billion annually, or over $70 billion when adjusted for inflation. The cartel was managing to smuggle over a dozen tons of cocaine into the U.S. every single day, solidifying its position as one of the most profitable and powerful criminal organizations in history. As Pablo's brother Roberto, who was responsible for much of the cartel's logistics and finances, later recounted, the cartel was so flush with cash that they spent $1,000 a week just on rubber bands to bundle the vast sums of money they were collecting. The money flowed so abundantly that it was estimated that up to 10% of the cartel's cash was lost or destroyed before it could even be spent due to poor storage conditions or theft, which further emphasized the vast scale of their operations and the chaotic nature of their wealth. Despite the immense wealth, Escobar's empire was not without its serious challenges. The war with the Cali cartel would continue throughout the late 1980s, with various levels of violence and competition. Meanwhile, the Colombian government was relentless in its pursuit of Escobar, both through military operations and diplomatic efforts with the United States to extradite him. But as Escobar's wealth continued to grow, so too did the personal costs, as his enemies, both domestic and foreign, mounted a coordinated campaign to bring him to justice. By the late 1980s, the Medellín cartel controlled approximately 80% of the world's cocaine trade, and Pablo Escobar had become one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. While estimates of his net worth varied, it was clear that Escobar used his vast fortune to bolster his reputation and power within Colombia. One of the ways he did this was through strategic investments in sport, particularly football, soccer, which became a key tool for his propaganda efforts. In the early 1980s, Escobar began funneling substantial financial support to the Atlético Nacional football team. In a few short years, he transformed the club from a mid-level team into one of Colombia's most successful, bringing in foreign players on lucrative contracts and attracting top Colombian talent. Under Escobar's influence, Atlético Nacional finished second in the 1988 Colombian National League Championship, which qualified them for the prestigious Copa Libertadores, the South American Club Championship. In 1989, Atlético Nacional made history by winning the Copa Libertadores, defeating Paraguay's Club Olimpia in a dramatic penalty shootout. This victory was not just a sporting achievement, but also a personal triumph for Escobar, who had invested heavily in the team. His financial backing won him many supporters in Medellín and across Colombia, helping to improve his image in the eyes of the public. It also provided him with a way to launder vast sums of drug money, often through illegal betting rings linked to football. However, as Escobar's influence over the sport grew, so did the scrutiny. In the early 1990s, football authorities began cracking down on the cartel's involvement in Colombian football, and Colombian teams, including Atlético Nacional, were banned from participating in the Copa Libertadores for a period. While Escobar's wealth and success in sport brought him significant public favor, the consequences of his drug empire were devastating for the city of Medellín and the country of Colombia as a whole. By the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Medellín had become one of the most violent cities in the world. The city's homicide rate was staggering. In 1991 alone, there were 7,237 murders, an average of 18 per day. This equated to a homicide rate of 266 murders per 100,000 people. The city's population had grown to more than 1.5 million by this time, making it increasingly difficult for authorities to maintain order. The violence spread beyond Medellín. In 1991, Colombia recorded over 25,000 violent deaths, and this number rose to over 27,000 in 1992. This figure meant an average of 70 violent deaths per day, or roughly one person killed every 20 minutes. The country was grappling with numerous conflicts, from the government's battles with the FARC guerrilla group to the ongoing wars between rival cartels. By the early 1990s, Colombia was considered a failed state, with lawlessness rampant across the nation. This widespread violence was largely attributed to Escobar and the Medellín cartel, whose criminal activities destabilized the country, creating a cycle of fear, violence, and political instability. Escobar's mass murder campaigns. The violence orchestrated by Pablo Escobar in Colombia was not limited to the typical acts of cartel warfare or political unrest. Escobar, in his pursuit of power and control, engaged in indiscriminate mass murder, targeting not only rival cartels and political figures, but also innocent civilians. One of the most notorious incidents occurred on November 27, 1989, when Avianca Flight 203, a domestic passenger flight traveling from Bogotá to Cali, was bombed. The explosion occurred just 5 minutes after takeoff, killing all 107 passengers on board and 3 individuals on the ground. Escobar had orchestrated the bombing with the aim of assassinating César Gaviria Trujillo, a presidential candidate who had publicly opposed the cartels and their influence on Colombia's political landscape. This bombing, intended to eliminate a political threat, was a horrifying example of Escobar's willingness to commit mass murder to further his goals. Just 2 weeks later, another devastating bombing took place in Bogotá, when a truck filled with half a ton of dynamite exploded outside the Administrative Department of Security building. The blast killed 57 people and injured over 2,000 others, with the target being General Miguel Alfredo Márquez, the department's director. These actions highlighted Escobar's descent into acts of terror, seeking to sow fear and chaos across Colombia. While he tried to portray himself as a Robin Hood-like figure to the public, these massacres demonstrated the brutal reality of his reign. Escobar's brutal tactics escalated with the assassination of Luis Carlos Galán, a long-standing political rival and presidential candidate, in August 1989. Galán had been gaining significant popularity and was leading in the national polls when he was gunned down on the outskirts of Bogotá. There is no doubt that Escobar ordered the assassination, as Galan had positioned himself as a staunch opponent of the cartels and was set to take a firm stance against Escobar and his criminal empire. Galan's death created a political void, which was filled by Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, who ultimately ran for and won the presidency in 1990. However, Escobar's violent campaign did not end with Galan's assassination. After the murder of Galan, the Colombian government, now led by Trujillo, made it clear that Escobar would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. In 1991, Colombia introduced a new constitution, which created a significant obstacle for the fight against the cartels. The constitution included a stipulation that Colombia would no longer honor the extradition treaty with the United States, a critical element in the fight against the powerful drug lords. Many analysts and contemporaries concluded that this move had been influenced by bribery, with Escobar and other cartel members reportedly paying off members of the National Assembly to ensure the extradition provision was excluded from the new constitution. This change was seen as a major victory for Escobar and the Medellín cartel, as it allowed him to avoid extradition to the United States, where he faced serious charges. With this legal protection in place, Escobar and his associates in the cartel were emboldened, continuing their reign of terror and violence throughout Colombia. With the threat of extradition to the United States temporarily removed by the 1991 Constitution, Escobar, now under intense pressure from both the Colombian government and the Cali cartel, decided to negotiate a new course of action. Escobar's strategy shifted to negotiating a deal with the Colombian government, offering to serve a limited jail sentence in exchange for an end to the ongoing conflict and a promise of relative freedom after serving his time. For Escobar, this arrangement presented the possibility of a fresh start within Colombia. The government, on the other hand, saw it as an opportunity to end the constant bloodshed that had plagued the country for nearly a decade, particularly the assassinations of politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials that Escobar had orchestrated. It was not a deal driven by honor, but for a country already embroiled in civil war and struggling with numerous other challenges, it was a practical solution to one of its most persistent problems. In 1991, Escobar voluntarily surrendered to Colombian authorities. However, the terms of his surrender were unconventional. Escobar insisted on a highly unusual condition. He demanded the right to build his own prison, and the government agreed to this request. What resulted was La Catedral, a facility unlike any traditional prison, built on a hilltop overlooking the city of Medellín. It was not designed to isolate Escobar from his criminal empire or the outside world, but instead to accommodate his continued influence and lifestyle. La Catedral, a fortress in disguise. Lerdo was anything but a typical prison. Escobar was granted an almost absurd level of luxury and freedom in his self-designed confinement. The prison was equipped with amenities more suited to a wealthy mansion than a place of incarceration. It featured a football pitch, a jacuzzi, a bar with a waterfall, and even a private telephone line. Escobar could also enjoy a bird's-eye view of the city through a telescope, allowing him to maintain a sense of control over his operations even from behind bars. The prison, often shrouded in fog due to its hilltop location, was more of a fortress than a jail. It was designed to be impenetrable, with the surrounding terrain providing natural protection against any attempts by the authorities or rival cartels to confront Escobar. La Catedral was not a traditional prison where Escobar was confined in a cell, but rather a luxurious retreat where he was under a form of voluntary house arrest. The terms of his sentence were that Escobar would spend no more than 5 years at La Catedral. In return, the Colombian government agreed to forgo extraditing him to the United States, allowing him to continue his drug trafficking operations with relative impunity. The government, in turn, could claim to have finally imprisoned the notorious drug lord, even though Escobar was free to continue his illegal activities from the comfort of his self-made palace. Despite the supposed arrangement, it became clear that Escobar was not fully under control in La Catedral. By early 1992, reports in the Colombian media began to surface, revealing that Escobar was still running the Medellín cartel from within the prison. Journalists exposed the luxurious conditions of his confinement, further highlighting the absurdity of the arrangement. Escobar was not confined to a cell. He continued to exert influence over his cartel and maintained his status as one of the most powerful figures in Colombia, all while living in what amounted to a lavish prison designed to serve his whims. La Catedral, far from being a site of imprisonment, became a symbol of Escobar's defiance of the state and his ability to manipulate the system. It was clear that he had outwitted the government once again, continuing to operate with little disruption to his empire, despite being technically incarcerated. This situation would soon lead to further complications as the Colombian government, frustrated by the situation, sought to regain control and end Escobar's influence over the country. Under mounting pressure, the Colombian government attempted to move Escobar to a more conventional prison in July 1992. However, word of this move reached him easily, and within the confines of La Catedral, a prison he had designed with little to no genuine restrictions on his movements, Escobar was able to escape without much difficulty. He had previously constructed an escape tunnel, complete with a false wall to conceal it, and when the time came, he simply removed the wall and fled through the tunnel. His escape was a clear indication of the extent to which Escobar had planned for such an eventuality, even while supposedly imprisoned. Escobar's flight from La Catedral marked the beginning of the final chapter of his life, ushering in an era of increased hostility and relentless pursuit. While he had successfully avoided being sent to a more traditional and restrictive prison, he now faced a government more determined than ever to capture him. The Colombian government, emboldened by the public outrage over Escobar's escape, made the decision to escalate the manhunt with full support from the United States. By the early 1990s, the U.S. had launched a high-stakes operation to capture Escobar. A division of the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, including the elite SEAL Team 6, was deployed to Colombia with the primary objective of apprehending Escobar and bringing him to the U.S. to face charges. The U.S. forces worked closely with Colombia's Search Block, a special operations unit created in 1986, which had been significantly bolstered in the early 1990s as part of the intensified effort to track down Escobar. In addition to these forces, Escobar's enemies were increasingly mobilized to help bring him down. The Cali Cartel, long rivals to Escobar's Medellín cartel, were more than willing to cooperate with the authorities to eliminate their competitor. Additionally, a vigilante group known as Los Pepes, which represented people who had lost loved ones to Escobar's violent campaign, emerged as another key player in the pursuit of the drug lord. Los Pepes had been operating since the late 1980s, seeking revenge on Escobar for the destruction he had caused. Their participation in the manhunt added a layer of complexity and danger to Escobar's already precarious situation. He gave an interview to a local radio station, in which he openly taunted the Colombian government and his adversaries. In the interview, Escobar detailed the escape from La Catedral, highlighting the audacity of his flight and his ability to outmaneuver the authorities. Despite his bravado, Escobar also made it clear that he was open to negotiating his return to custody if certain conditions were met. Specifically, that he be allowed to finish his sentence at La Catedral, the prison he had designed for himself. However, the Colombian government had reached its breaking point. There would be no negotiations, and the manhunt intensified. Search Block, working alongside U.S. Special Forces like Delta Force, began combing the streets of Medellín and Bogotá. The joint operations led to house-to-house searches, and efforts were ramped up to track down Escobar's closest associates, who could potentially provide crucial information on his whereabouts. In December 1992, the manhunt brought the authorities close to capturing Escobar. They raided a safe house he was known to have frequented, but the elusive drug lord managed to evade capture once again. His ability to stay one step ahead of his pursuers only added to the mythos of Escobar, who continued to defy the authorities and elude the combined efforts of Colombia and the U.S. forces. On December 2, 1993, one of the most notorious figures in the history of the Colombian drug trade, Pablo Escobar, met his end in a violent confrontation with law enforcement. Escobar, the feared leader of the Medellín cartel, had been on the run for nearly 18 months following his dramatic escape from La Catedral, his luxurious self-built prison. His capture, a culmination of an intense surveillance operation, marked the end of an era of terror and control over the cocaine trade. Escobar's downfall had been a long time in the making. As the pressure on him mounted, his once loyal supporters began to desert him. Many of his allies, realizing the inevitable fate that awaited him, distanced themselves. A shift in loyalty that was starkly symbolized by the killing of his brother-in-law at the hands of Los Pepes, a paramilitary group targeting Escobar's associates. Escobar's final hideout was located in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín, a middle-class area where he had sought refuge after fleeing his prison. On the morning of December 2nd, a special forces unit, with assistance from U.S. operatives, raided the safe house. Upon being discovered, Escobar and his bodyguard, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as El Lemon, attempted to flee across the rooftops of neighboring houses. Gunfire erupted, and within moments, Escobar was lying dead on the roof. He had been shot multiple times, with the fatal bullet striking his ear, entering his head and instantly killing him. Though some speculated that Escobar may have taken his own life to avoid extradition to the United States, his brother Roberto later claimed that Pablo had always vowed to kill himself rather than face capture. Whether this was the case or not, the outcome was the same. Pablo Escobar, the infamous El Patron, was dead at the age of 44, just one day after his birthday. The news of his death sent shockwaves through Colombia and the world. Despite his reign of terror, Escobar had cultivated a Robin Hood image, and this image was reinforced by the overwhelming turnout at his funeral. Over 25,000 mourners attended, many of whom had viewed Escobar as a figure who, despite his criminal activities, had brought wealth and social benefits to certain sectors of society. In the wake of Escobar's death, the power vacuum in Colombia's drug trade was quickly filled by the Cali Cartel, which became the dominant force in cocaine trafficking. However, a new rival organization, the North Valley Cartel, emerged in the region, signaling that the battle for control of Colombia's drug trade was far from over. Escobar's violent end may have brought an end to his personal empire, but his legacy of terror, wealth, and influence left an indelible mark on Colombia's history and the global drug trade. Following Pablo Escobar's death in 1993, the drug trade in Colombia continued to evolve, albeit with significant changes in its structure and geography. Both the Cali Cartel and the emerging North Valley Cartel increasingly focused their efforts on trafficking cocaine through Mexico, as the Caribbean routes to Florida and the east coast of the United States became increasingly difficult to navigate in the 1990s. This shift in trafficking routes reflected the changing dynamics of the drug trade as law enforcement became more adept at intercepting shipments. By the mid-1990s, the Cali Cartel was largely dismantled and its successor syndicates emerged, including the North Coast Cartel, based in Barranquilla. This cartel concentrated on supplying cocaine networks in Europe, particularly to the eastern markets. Despite the disruption of major cartels, Colombia's drug trade was far from eradicated, as new criminal organizations arose, often using increasingly violent tactics to gain control of the lucrative cocaine market. However, Colombia's long history of political and drug-related violence began to shift as the 21st century unfolded. In 2016, the Colombian government and the FARC rebels reached a historic ceasefire agreement, signaling a potential end to over 50 years of paramilitary conflict that had torn the country apart. This agreement also heralded a new era for cities like Medellín, which had been the epicenter of Escobar's reign of terror. Since Escobar's death, Medellín has experienced a remarkable transformation. Crime rates, which had once made the city the murder capital of the world, dropped dramatically following the collapse of the Medellín cartel in the mid-1990s. The city became a model for urban development, attracting significant investment and revamping its transport infrastructure. Medellín now stands as a hub for business and industry in Colombia, praised internationally for its innovative public transportation system and environmental initiatives. Though the city has largely moved past its violent past, remnants of Escobar's influence remain. La Catedral, the luxurious prison Escobar built for himself, stood abandoned for many years after his death. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, it became a symbol of his unchecked power and opulence. However, in 2007, a group of Benedictine monks took over the site, converting it into a religious sanctuary with a library and other amenities, thus repurposing the space in stark contrast to its former use as a symbol of Escobar's empire. Further, the legacy of Escobar's exotic animals persists to this day. The hippos he brought to his Hacienda Nápoles estate have thrived in the wild, with their population steadily increasing, a strange testament to his lasting mark on Colombia's landscape. Pablo Escobar's rise and fall are inextricably linked to the larger story of Colombia's turbulent journey through drug trafficking, political violence, and its eventual path to recovery. From his humble beginnings in the urban slums of Medellín to becoming the world's most powerful drug lord, Escobar's influence shaped Colombia in ways that are still felt today. As the country moves forward, its continued efforts to overcome its violent past and embrace a future of peace and development show a resilience that Escobar's reign could never fully extinguish. The rise and fall of Pablo Escobar is a topic that continues to provoke intense debate. Some argue that Escobar's emergence as the head of the Medellín cartel was inevitable, given Colombia's tumultuous political and economic landscape. If Escobar hadn't risen to power, it's likely someone else would have. Yet his reign left an indelible mark on the country, particularly in Medellín, where his actions both fueled the drug trade and shaped the lives of many disenfranchised citizens. At the height of his power, Escobar garnered support from the poor by providing them with financial aid, creating jobs, and building vital infrastructure. His charitable endeavors, including funding the Atlético Nacional football team and even giving people free access to the zoo at his Hacienda Nápoles, helped solidify his Robin Hood image. These efforts painted Escobar as a man of the people, someone who used his wealth for the benefit of those abandoned by the government. However, this narrative of Escobar as a modern-day Robin Hood is far more complicated. While his wealth did indeed bring some relief to the impoverished, it also enabled a reign of terror that would devastate Colombia for years. Escobar's actions were responsible for unspeakable violence, with Medellín alone suffering nearly one-third of the country's violent deaths during the height of his power. From the mid-1980s onward, his war with the Colombian government and rival cartels, such as the Cali cartel, caused unprecedented bloodshed, culminating in bombings, assassinations, and mass killings, including the infamous bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989. Escobar's willingness to murder thousands of innocent civilians to eliminate his enemies revealed the darker side of his empire. His philanthropic gestures, while significant, cannot overshadow the horrific toll his actions took on Colombia's society. The violence he perpetuated plunged the country into chaos, and for many, the deaths and destruction he caused far outweigh any good he may have done for the poor. Despite the economic gains his cartel brought to the region, it's clear that the legacy of Pablo Escobar is far more sinister. While some may still view him as a hero to the people of Medellín, the majority see him as a ruthless mass murderer driven by power and greed. In reflecting on Escobar's life and actions, one must ask, was he the Colombian Robin Hood he tried to portray himself as, or simply a ruthless criminal and profiteer? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you for watching.